Good afternoon, my name is Jiwon Park, and today I will present a paper called Deep Compression Autoencoder for Efficient High-Resolution Diffusion Models, which is presented at ICLR this year, and let me start with the demo video. In this example, the standard SDVAE, which means Stable Diffusion using Variational Autoencoder, can generate only one image, while the proposed DCAE can generate 16 images in the same amount of time. This demonstrates the core contribution of the paper that by reducing the number of latent tokens through better compression, can we accelerate high-resolution diffusion without sacrificing the quality? With that in mind, let's move on to the overview of today's presentation. I will begin with the background of the latent diffusion and motivate why autoencoder design plays an important role in the efficiency. And next, I will summarize the key ideas of the paper, and then we walk through the proposed method. And after that, I will talk about the experimental results demonstrating the speed and the quality benefits of the DCAE. Before introducing DCAE, let me briefly review latent diffusion models and how they emerged in the broader diffusion literature. Early diffusion models such as DDPM operated directly in the pixel space. They achieved impressive image quality, but the computation was extremely heavy because the model had to denoise every pixel across many time steps, even though natural images contain a lot of spatial redundancy. And to overcome this inefficiency, latent diffusion models were introduced. The idea is simple. Compress the image first and run diffusion in this much smaller latent space. And this kind of two-stage design, semantic compression followed by generative models, reduces computation dramatically while keeping high visual fidelity. But even with latent diffusion, the key question remains: can the autoencoder actually handle such strong spatial compression? And in latent diffusion, the autoencoder is deliberately trained to compress the image very aggressively. For example, Stable Diffusion reduces each spatial dimension by a factor of 8, and this level of compression inevitably introduces reconstruction distortion, meaning the decoded image is not perfectly identical to the input. And as we push compression further, these distortions grow rapidly. So even though latent diffusion reduces computation by working in a compressed latent space, the autoencoder itself becomes a limiting factor, because pushing compression beyond F8 quickly breaks reconstruction quality. Because of this limitation, many follow-up works try to improve inefficiency somewhere else, mainly inside the diffusion process itself. One focuses on reducing the number of inference sampling steps, or distillation-based one-step or few-step diffusion models. And these methods significantly speed up generation by replacing long sampling chains with much shorter ones. And second direction focuses on compressing the denoiser itself, using sparsity or quantization to reduce computation. These techniques made the backbone lighter or cheaper to run, but they still keep the latent representation unchanged. Across all these methods, one thing remains the same: the autoencoder has not modified. And why the autoencoder itself becomes a major bottleneck in latent diffusion models? That is because there is a severe information bottleneck. At high compression ratios, each latent channel is forced to store far more information than it can realistically handle, and the model relies on aggressive downsampling using large stride convolutions. And this results in the conflicting gradients because a single latent token ends up representing highly heterogeneous content. This is the bottleneck that our work addresses, improving the autoencoder to reduce the token count at the representation level, not just inside the sampler. Before diving into our method, let me briefly explain what we mean by the spatial compression ratios, denoted as F. The compression factor F simply describes how much autoencoder reduces the spatial resolution. For example, F8 turns an H by W image into an H over 8 by W over 8 latent grid. So the main issue is that high-resolution latent diffusion still uses many spatial tokens, and increasing compression is the most direct way to reduce them. But the standard SDVAE breaks when pushed beyond F8, which is why previous works focused only on the denoiser. We need an autoencoder that can compress much more strongly while keeping semantic fidelity, and DCAE is built exactly for this kind of purpose. To introduce the first component of DCAE, we use a simple operation called space-to-channel or S2C. S2C reduces spatial resolution by folding neighboring pixels into channels, and since it is a non-parametric reshape, it avoids losing information. And this provides a clean downsample step on which our residual autoencoder is built. Now let me explain the core idea of residual autoencoding, in both downsampling and the upsampling. The main idea is to avoid aggressive stride-based convolutions, which usually destroy high-frequency details and make high-compression VAEs collapse. And S2C simply rearranges the pixels into the channel dimension, so it reduces the spatial resolution without losing information. And after S2C, channel averaging is applied, which produces a smooth, low-frequency baseline representation. This baseline acts as a stable scaffold for the encoder. Then, on the residual path, the learned downsample block focuses only on predicting the missing details on top of the shortcut. Because the baseline is already provided by S2C and averaging, the learned path only needs to model residuals rather than the full compression mapping. This separation, shortcut plus residual, stabilizes optimization and allows the autoencoder to operate reliably at high spatial compression ratios. In other words, we removed the hardest point of the compression problem and let the learned block correct only what it is necessary. Although we solved issues in the first phase and achieved stable low-resolution training, there is still remaining problems when moving to the high-resolution images. We train the autoencoder on low-resolution inputs like 256 by 256, but when we apply the same model to higher resolutions, the reconstruction quality drops sharply. Under high compression factors like F32, each latent token covers a much larger spatial region, which amplifies the distribution mismatch between low-resolution training and high-resolution inference. As a result, the model produces blurred or distorted textures. And fully retraining the entire autoencoder on high-resolution images would be ideal, but this is computationally too expensive. So we need a more efficient solution that adapts the latent space to high-resolution data without retraining the whole model. This motivates the decoupled high-resolution adaptation. And this is an adaptation strategy with 3 phases. Phase 1 is full training of the residual autoencoder on low-resolution images. And this learns the overall compression and the reconstruction behavior very efficiently, without the high memory cost of large images. And step 2 adapts the latent space to high-resolution statistics. Here, we freeze most of the encoder and decoder and train only the middle layers, the encoder head and the decoder input layers. And this small amount of tuning is enough to fix the high-resolution generalization gap. And phase 3 applies local refinement using GAN loss, but only the encoder's head layers. And this allows the GAN to improve local textures, sharpness, without disturbing the latent space we establish it in phase 2. And overall, by decoupling what is trained at each resolution level, DCAE avoids the instability of full high-resolution training while still achieving high-resolution fidelity and efficient compression. Before we dive into the experimental results, let me explain the metric used in the paper. RFID measures the distribution gap between the original images and their autoencoder reconstructions. Lower RFID means the autoencoder preserves semantics and perceptual structure more faithfully. Unlike the usual FID used for generative models, RFID isolates the autoencoder's quality without involving the diffusion model. Let's look at how the proposed DCAE performs in practice. Starting from the figure A, we compare the reconstruction RFID across different compression ratios. You can see that the standard SDVAE quickly collapses as we move to higher compression levels. In contrast, DCAE maintains extremely low RFID all the way up to F128. This confirms that our residual autoencoding design successfully stabilizes high compression training. Next, when we plug DCAE into diffusion backbones, it produces significantly better generation quality even with far fewer latent tokens. Combined with the 19 times inference speedup at F64, these results clearly show that representation level compression is the key to efficient high-resolution diffusion. Here we show the ablation studies that verify the necessity of our 2 main components. On the left, Without residual autoencoding, RFID quickly explodes at high compression levels. With our residual design, RFID stays extremely low and stable across all compressions, demonstrating that the shortcut plus residual structure prevents collapse. And on the right, you can see that when the autoencoder is trained only at low resolution, the reconstruction collapses as soon as we move to high resolution inputs, especially at higher compression. After applying our decoupled high resolution adaptation, the reconstruction quality at high resolution is restored to the same level as the low resolution case. This shows that updating only the middle layers is enough to eliminate the high resolution generalization issue. Here you can see the reconstruction behavior of the standard SDVAE under high compression. At F32, it already loses the fine details, and F64, facial structure starts to break apart, and at F128, the reconstruction collapses entirely. In contrast, when we switch into DCAE, the reconstruction quality remains stable and visually consistent across all compression levels. So we not only get high fidelity reconstruction at extreme compression, but we do so with much higher speed and much lower computation cost. And this is the end of my presentation. And before we wrap up, let me raise a discussion point. Last class, we talked about the deep image prior paper, which showed that an untrained convolutional network architecture itself can act as a strong natural image prior. In contrast, DCAE argues that convolution-based downsampling harms information under extreme compression, and therefore they replaced it with a non-parametric operations like S2C. And this raises the question that can we combine the strengths of these two views? And one possibility is to bring DIP-style priors into the DCAE decoder. For example, the decoder head could include an untrained or weakly trained CNN block that acts as an implicit architectural prior, while the residual path handles the learned corrections. This might improve fine detail realism without modifying the latent space, and it could also reduce our reliance on GAN loss in phase 3. So the broader discussion here is, what is the right balance between non-parametric compression and implicit CNN priors inside high compression generative models?